Hey everyone, and welcome back. I wanted to do a short video today just talking about the idea of teaching about race in our classes. I think we're all familiar right now at this moment in our history, focused on Black Lives Matter, focused on just the increasing numbers of hate crimes in the United States, anti-Semitism, white supremacy, really kind of a global movement thinking about these issues and thinking about racial justice and diversity in a more pronounced sense than maybe we have in the past. So you're pretty familiar with the fact that we've been having conversations on campus. These will continue into next year. We'll get into some of these initiatives and what they are. So certainly we're at a really good moment, a depressing moment in terms of what's happening in the world, but also a positive moment in that more and more people are bringing racial awareness to the table in conversations of an everyday nature. Just over the last couple of weeks, if you saw what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin, with another police killing and then a terrorist act by a white supremacist teenager, the NBA, including coaches, including owners, including players, came to the conversation and really shifted dialogue such that games were suspended in the NBA playoffs. So I think there's an awareness now that we can no longer be silent about race. We have to address our own complicity or our own ways in which we're responsible for not achieving racial justice, or we're responsible for not addressing our own, like in my case, white privilege or white male privilege. And so this video today is just intended to shift dialogue, I think, towards the classroom setting and to really initiate some conversations. So the focus today is teaching race in our classes. And I just should mention here that there have been quite a few initiatives this year leading into fall that have focus on this, really starting in spring and continuing through the summer. Pictured here is our student forum that many of you participated in, and there were quite a few of these student fora created with Laura Salinas and J.D. Durk and their efforts to really shift the dialogue towards our students and our student body to really talk about how we can be more supportive of our students, particularly our students of color or students maybe from underrepresented populations, transgender students, or students dealing with disabilities. There's a kind of wide range of diversity perspectives out there, and certainly we have a vital role to play in our students' lives, and certainly we've been doing this in the past, so we shouldn't say that just because there's this moment in our history right now that we haven't been doing this in our classrooms. Of course, we have been doing many of these efforts. So let's just review some of the initiatives from this year so we can get a sense of the scope of things and maybe what's coming. I wanted to mention too, if you go to ltccteachingandlearning.com at any time, just click on the diversity tab, and once you do that, you can look at the most current information. So I have all the information here related to the Academic Senate's statements, 2 statements, the CES officer statement, a number of other statements will be added here. So as an example, the Academic Senate created its own statement on inequity and racism, and it has a series of steps listed. And I'm really hopeful this year. I'm no longer a part of the Senate. I am as a faculty member, but no longer as an officer representative. But I was involved certainly in drafting a lot of this with all of you through surveys, through a teaching talk, through conversations online, and so forth. This kind of covers a lot of areas of LTCC. In particular, though, we might look at perspectives on diversity in which they're addressed in classroom settings. And so if you look here, it would be this section. The Academic Senate states a commitment to inclusive and diverse curriculum, pedagogical practices, classroom and professional approaches. So a lot has been said here, and we can continue to talk about how some of these actions might happen next year. Again, it's a much more collaborative thing. I'm only trying to preview this and not state any actions, because that has to come, of course, collectively through the faculty, through all of our individual efforts as well as our collective efforts. I would mention, when we talk about things like ethnic studies, you're probably aware of the fact that the CSU is now requiring an ethnic studies requirement for graduation, and that happened through legislation and also work at the CSUs. So a lot of this is happening throughout our systems, community colleges, CSUs, and I assume also the UCs. So I won't delve into this in depth, but wanted to mention that this is one statement I think that could potentially guide some of our efforts going forward. You can look at the other statements that have been made by other groups as well and certainly take a look. You can also click on this Decolonizing Syllabus, and this is an example of how this is from the really great group Academics for Black Survival and Wellness. I know that Elizabeth Loudon has been involved in this particular group. I heard great things about them and what they're doing. And this is one of their resources about decolonizing a syllabus. And they mention here the important work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a really great thinker who came up with the theory of intersectionality, which looks at the intersections of forms of oppression, could be xenophobia, nationalism, classism, sexism, homophobia, and how those intersect one another and affect people in multiple categories through forms of interlocking systems of oppression. So very important conversation to be had, certainly going forward, about how it's not just about racial justice, but it's about identifying intersectional forms of power, intersectional forms of oppression that take place in society and certainly also in our students' lives. So this will take you through a series of checklists to talk about how you could design your syllabus in a more equitable way. You could talk about policies and so forth. Teaching materials. I've considered, liberation-focused images in my syllabus. I've considered how and why my course begins with theories, examples, and case studies rooted in white and Western theories. And I'm trying to talk about this in a way because I realize, one, I'm not an expert on all your disciplines. Two, if I bring up a discipline, I don't want to give the suggestion that somehow you're not doing it in your discipline. So I think to get around that, I'll talk about disciplines we're not teaching, or I'll talk about my own discipline. So let's say I'm teaching an anthropology class, and to take this checkbox here. And if I have all the theorists of anthropology listed and saying we're covering these people and these people and these people, and those are all white people, they're all rooted in Western experience, then that's a real issue, right? Because then I'm only giving case studies that are reflecting a particular Western or white bias. So that's an example of taking your curriculum and maybe rethinking why it is the way it is. The idea of the canon that some of you may have studied in English, and certainly English is a discipline that is way embedded in multiculturalism and post-colonial literature and all that really powerful stuff. But you could say the canon itself is the foundation of any discipline that we often teach. So for teaching cultural anthropology, we maybe start with guys like Morgan and Maine early on in anthropological theory. And they had a particular notion that not only was a theory of anthropology, but happens to be racist and xenophobic and ethnocentric. So they had a theory that cultures evolved from primitive, savage to more civilized. And of course, the always most civilized cultures out there were European white and American white cultures. So we teach certainly cultural evolutionary theory today, but there's a giant asterisk that we have next to those theories, and we say, look, we can see the racism, we can see the inherent xenophobia and bias embedded in these theories. We will teach them, but we will also learn from the past and see how wrong-headed and racist and xenophobic those theories were, given our perspective in time today. And we have that knowledge, fortunately. Anthropology itself is a discipline founded on a lot of racist and racialist assumptions. Franz Boas, who is one of the founding figures of American anthropology, was actually attacked and censored by many anthropologists because he was trying to bring out the racism and draw attention to it, and the anti-Semitism in academia in American and Europeanist anthropology well over 100 years ago. So I mention this because there's a lot of foundations in all of our disciplines that may have racialism or racist assumptions and foundations, or Western-centric foundations or xenophobic foundations. So it's a great opportunity to kind of go through and decolonize our syllabus and really take issue with the forms of colonization that are part of knowledge systems and systems of knowledge. So in any case, you could look at this list and check through it. I wouldn't say this is necessarily has to be a practical list. You could see it as a list that could guide perspective moving through your class or your discipline in the future. Again, I'm not making the assumption that you're not doing this or anything like that. I'm just trying to create a dialogue and conversation about it. I'm not approaching it in such a way to say you are or aren't doing it. That's certainly your own perspective to think about. So this is an example from counseling psychology called Decolonizing My Counseling Psychology Syllabus Checklist. Kind of cool to see this. So that is available on the diversity page of the LTCC Teaching and Learning if you ever want to check that out. Now, another resource I'll mention is this resource that a number of us have been involved in over the summer. I can share this out with you, so if you'd like to see this, please let me know. I'll send you the URL. It has all of the diversity statements, system-wide statements, racism resources, including some resources related to our local student town hall, focus on language, hate groups, intersectionality, mental health, institutional efforts, grading, curriculum. So grading for equity is kind of an interesting movement you might want to check out. If you were at the statewide online teaching conference, there was a whole panel on this very topic. Curriculum, teaching and pedagogy, and syllabi. A little more information on syllabi if you want to look. And then these are discipline specific. I don't have these all filled out. If you want to add any of these, I only found art history, a BLM curriculum resource guide, anthropology and sociology, since those are the two disciplines I teach in, human resources and hiring, anti-violence and policing, a lot of discussion of policing right now, resource collections, and readings. Feel free to use some of these readings if you like. They might be helpful for thinking about some of these topics. Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege and Packing the Invisible Knapsack is a great conversation piece, icebreaker, if you will, that you could use in any class, even if you're not teaching soc or anthro, psychology, English, whatever. And then a little more implicit bias, some videos and media, and so forth. So if you want to use all these, I will send you the link and you can participate as well in the conversation going on. We've had a really great ability to engage with a few people on campus over the summer. We met a couple times and had some conversations about how to build out these resources. So more to come on that. So you're probably pretty familiar with the fact that we started this year the USC Race and Equity Center initiative. And I know that messages will be going out in the near future. I think there are a number of convenings coming up this year, so that will certainly be an effort that will be helpful in guiding conversations on campus. And I know that Dr. Vijay Pendakur will be speaking this year for Convocation, and a variety of other speakers will also be coming in this year. So all that energy that's happening with conversations, with maybe people reading similar books and readings this year on campus, will no doubt lend to positive impacts on how we think about race and also teach race in our various settings. So as I said earlier, keep in mind I only know my disciplines. I teach in a discipline where there's actually a class taught called Sociology of Race and Ethnic Relations. So it's certainly natural that some of this is in my wheelhouse because of my teaching. That being said, I think there's an opportunity to consider race and these topics of diversity in every single discipline out there. And I think there would be a presumed assumption that certain disciplines like the social sciences or humanities maybe cover race more commonly because it's part of their readings or it's part of their foundations in terms of what they study. We probably, though, need to shift the conversation and say everything in the world is implicated in race. You could turn on the TV. I was just watching a new show about real estate on Netflix called $1 Million Beach House. And I thought, it's going to be something sort of apolitical that wouldn't necessarily implicate race. And in fact, what happened in the show or happens in the show is that one of the African-American characters is continually vilified. And if you watch the show, the other characters who are all white or Caucasian are constantly engaging in what we call microaggressions. And I was curious about this, so I Googled the show, and like all these big publications had all these articles saying a lot of people are really concerned that in the time of Black Lives Matter, we're having microaggressions and the vilification, the attacks on an African-American character. And there's actually a trope or a theme that happens commonly in reality television. If you know Omarosa, who was on The Apprentice and who worked for the Trump administration for a while, she was often seen as a villain. And so that particular trope or approach is very common in a lot of reality television. And there have been other incidents on other reality TV shows recently that you may have heard of that also had racialist or racist implications. So I'm mentioning that because you turn on the TV and it's likely you could turn on any possible subject or context like sports that we talked about earlier in the NBA, and actually race maybe is at the forefront of conversations for a variety of different reasons. So I'm suggesting that so maybe to shift the idea that there are certain disciplines out there or subjects or types of classes that are more conducive to talking about race or diversity. We can talk about race or diversity in all of our classes and all of our disciplines with maybe just a little bit of a conversation about how that might happen. And so the example I'll use today actually is from kind of my other life world, and that is doing a lot of work in electronic music. And in the process of making some videos and having conversations with people about electronic music, I discovered this very cool Afrorack organization. So Afrorack is an organization in Chicago that's trying to bring awareness about modular synthesis and electronic music technology to Black and Brown youth. And it's a very cool conversation that this initiates, because I think you wouldn't necessarily think of electronic music as connecting to race. And I know a lot of people have been donating, and if you go to their webpage, there's a whole series of dialogues about how this foundation was started and why it's specifically focused on race and specific communities of race. I mention this because you wouldn't think of Afrorack synthesis necessarily as having to do with race at any level. And so with that in mind, what I would suggest is to go back to our own disciplines. We could certainly have conversations regardless of what we teach and the specific types of classes or the content in it about race. And we'll talk about some ways to do that, but at a general level, you could certainly require as a reading, even if you're teaching in a discipline that doesn't have maybe political science readings or something of that nature, you could require something like Peggy McIntosh's Invisible Knapsack as the first week icebreaker, because we often do icebreakers in a class. And regardless of the discipline that you're teaching, the icebreaker may actually fall outside of that discipline. It might be something totally unrelated to what you're teaching, because it's an icebreaker. So one way of doing this is in week one of the class, to have a discussion board, to have a reading, maybe do a video Zoom session, and then have a conversation with your students about an article like Peggy McIntosh's White Privilege Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And so that's kind of like the first opportunity that isn't discipline specific, because you're using it as an icebreaker. And if you want access to that article, you can simply Google Peggy McIntosh or Google Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And I can send you that link as well. So just zip me an email and be happy to do that. So it doesn't have to be that article, but you could have a short video. You could have anything. It could even be a general conversation with your students and say, in light of what's been happening in this country, in light of the NBA boycotts, in light of the marches across the country, across the world related to Black Lives Matter, what is your view on what's been happening? And you could frame a conversation. You may have to frame dialogue and what that dialogue is going to look like, just because it likely will be a heated conversation, as we could gather from any number of conversations we've had about these subjects related to diversity, equity, racial justice, Black Lives Matter, whatever the topic is. So opportunity one is to do a week one icebreaker. The second opportunity is to really dive into your discipline. And I'm suggesting here to find 2 or 3 concepts or issues that you can teach about or engage either in a reading, a video, a discussionless conversation, and so forth. And again, to make this very neutral, because we don't teach electronic music at the college, I'll use this as an example. And it's an integral part of my life, certainly. And I haven't thought about necessarily race in electronic music, but one thing I've thought about in watching a lot of electronic music podcasts on YouTube, a lot of practical tutorial stuff, is that there tends to be a lot of white people and a lot of males. And so it's something you note, and that actually leads then into some of the ideas here. So I'm suggesting 3 ways of really approaching this. This is doing something very specific in your class. It could be at different points in the quarter, but it nonetheless focuses on race or diversity or social justice at some level. So the first is to really maybe, if you're approaching your class or discipline, you think, well, electronic music, Afrorack synthesis, how does working with a mixer relate to race? And I don't think it really does. And what could I do to really think about that? So maybe think about a list, creating a list, and jot down some ways in which race or social justice, again, you might cover gender or different levels of diversity. But let's just say race for the purpose of this conversation. So I would look at creating a list of the implications of race in electronic music. So how might race be part of electronic music, even if I don't typically think about it? To go back to that example of what I think is a very racist show, $1 Million Beach House on Netflix, which is one of the top shows out there. And my concerns about that being a top show is if people don't see the racialist or racist implications of the microaggressions of creating a villain out of an African-American character, then that becomes part of their subconscious. I know Human Resources does a lot of work with the implicit bias studies from Harvard. The studies themselves would suggest then that a lot of our foundations, if you will, the canon, not the canon of literature or of music, but the canon of our own personal lives, psychologically, socially, politically, often is invested with a lot of racist and racialist assumptions that we learn from our parents, that we learn growing up. We might learn it from playing sports. We might learn it in our elementary school classes. There are a lot of different ways in which we learn it. We often learn it in ways that are part of what's called the hidden curriculum. We're not being directly taught something, but it affects how we perceive the world. So if I'm watching $1 Million Beach House through the lens of it's about real estate and it's about, fights between different people on the show who are competing for listings of these exclusive houses, $7 million houses in the Hamptons on the East Coast, and I say it has nothing to do with race or gender or whatever, any of those social justice, diversity topics, then I'm allowing that to kind of filter, if you will, create this own internalized perception about people based on not confronting the biases inherent in that particular text of media, that particular show on Netflix. So likewise, if I'm approaching electronic music and saying, it's about synthesis, it's about oscillators, it's about filters, it's about mixing, it's about decibels, it's about all that kind of stuff that happens in music and technology, and it's not about race, I'm making that same assumption. I'm sort of approaching the topic with blinders on. So to remove those blinders, I might begin to make a list and say, okay, I'm assuming that race doesn't play a role in electronic music. Well, let me look at some demographic data. Let me look at artists. Let me look at recording engineers. Let me look at people who are sound engineers working in the field, in movies, doing sound and so forth. Do those people represent a broad range of demographic spectra from race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, social class, disability, ability, and so forth? When people get jobs in those fields, is there a pay gap? Is there a wage gap between women and men in the field? Is there a gap between African Americans and European Americans in the field, Asians, and so forth? So I could start to do some demographic profiling. And in a lot of these industries, I may discover that indeed there are disparities. One that comes up time and time again, I just saw a graphic, I'll try to put it in post-production here, but it was of how the same types of characters in various movies look the same. And there was one, and I think it's Margot Robbie, who's a really good actress, but they were saying, why is it that actresses in different movies, different actresses, they're not the same, playing different parts, different actresses playing different roles in different movies look kind of the same. They're all white, they're a particular size in terms of their body, their proportions, their facial features. And then someone did this for male actors. So I'll put that up in post-production now so you can see it. The point there is to say there clearly is some sort of bias going on in casting, in people who land roles. For many years in the modeling industry, conversations were had about how dark-skinned women from various cultures and various backgrounds did not get jobs in modeling, and that lighter-skinned women, including some Latinx women and African-American women, got jobs because on a color gradient, which if you look at some South American countries, we often talk about color gradients and how not just the race, but the tone of your skin from light to dark can actually impact discrimination and stereotyping and getting a job. So a lot of those fields, for years, they didn't encounter this, and it was sort of like unspoken. It's just like watching a show on Netflix and saying, well, it's about real estate. Well, it's about real estate, but it's also about race, and it's also about gender. So an example of this then would be to look at all this demographic data in various fields and jobs related to electronic music. We can also talk about empowerment skill sets. So what kind of skill sets do you get in technology if you learn electronic music, and how can those be applied to getting a job? And that's more like an empowerment kind of theme that could be had. And that goes back to that conversation that we had earlier about the Afrorack organization in Chicago. And then another one, racial assumptions present in the field, jobs, and context. So you might discover in a particular field, in the culinary field, as an example, that maybe front of house workers in restaurants tend to be of a certain race, or a certain social class, or a certain gender background or appearance. And then back of house workers maybe are from certain ethnic groups, or certain genders, or certain appearances, or certain age ranges. And once you start to kind of chart that out, how that works, you begin to see that those racialist assumptions, or gender, whatever, class assumptions are embedded in particular fields. And the only way to deal with that embeddedness is to, one, raise awareness that it exists, and two, systemically deconstruct and dismantle the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, the classism inherent in those structures. If you read folks like Michael Eric Dyson today, if you read folks like Cornel West, they're talking about how race is a systemic issue. So awareness is the first thing, but then if we don't do part two, which is the systemic side of things, we really haven't done our job. And that's where we have to encounter the racialist assumptions or racism, acts of racism, stereotyping, whatever that is present in particular fields, jobs, and contexts. So what I recommend is you create this list first. It's sort of the list of saying ways I didn't think about race in particular fields or class areas of study, or types of scientific research or readings. Create that list, and then based on that list, you could potentially then go to part three, which is choosing 2 or 3 of those issues and connecting them to a class activity. But part two, another way to do this, if you're saying, I'm really stuck and I can't think of ways in which race is implicated in electronic music, you could do a Google search. And so you could take any term. Again, I just thought it this morning, like, well, what if you were teaching science, a biology class, and you wanted to talk about race? So literally you could type in the phrase teaching about race in, that could be your general phrase, and then type in your discipline or specific field. Music, let's try that. I had biology. Actually, let's just look at biology. You can look at a couple of these. They're interesting. So as you can see, can biology class reduce racism? Teaching diversity. Should race be taught in high school biology? Toolkit for just science, teaching tolerance. Some of this will come from organizations more in the science world. Others might be more in that race and tolerance diversity world. You might see other resources here, anti-racism resources and articles for STEM educators. So just by doing that search, if you look at the top 10 links or so, you will find some interesting things. Like this one, science is never neutral. And again, I don't know how good these are, but click on them, check them out, use your academic abilities and knowledge to decide if these might work for you. But it's as simple as that. And let's do one other example. So teaching about race in music. Here you go. Here's an article, Popular Music in the Classroom, Teaching Race, Teaching Whiteness in Music Class, Hidden in Plain Sight, Race and Racism in Music Education, Promoting Equity, Developing Anti-Racist Music Theory, Anti-Racist Pedagogy, Finding Music Resources. So I would be hard-pressed to say if you typed any discipline in here, whatever it is, it's probably going to come up. What about culinary arts? See if there's stuff in here. Okay, the podcast, Taking on Racism in the Food Industry. So a lot of these didn't look like it was talking about food trucks and so forth, but that one that comes up here, I don't know Yes Magazine, but that is talking about racism in the food industry. So, and you could say there's probably a lot of, racist and racialist assumptions that happen in food, where people are stereotyped through food, and those, in some cases in everyday life, become forms of microaggressions, where people make assumption about the diet of a person based on their race or something like that. So that is step 2 there, if you will. If you're getting stuck, do a Google search, type in that phrase, and let me just put that up here so we remember it. Use the phrase, okay, and then just fill in the blanks, so whatever your discipline is. And so that might be a great opportunity to get one of those articles, and that's really part 3. So take 2 or 3 of the things that you learned about either in creating your list or creating a list starting with that Google search teaching about race in whatever your discipline is. Choose 2 or 3 of these and connect them to a teaching assignment, reading, video activity, or discussion. So as an example, if I take electronic music, and if I discover that there's racism in the music industry because only certain people are hired for certain positions, I could type that as a prompt. I might say to my students for a discussion board, let's say, I recently read this article that says that certain jobs in the music industry are only had or only attained by people from European American male, upper socioeconomic or upper middle socioeconomic class or something like this. Why do you think that's the case, and what can we do in our lives if we're going into music or recording or the music industry? We want to be a performer or an engineer. What can we do when we enter the field to deal with that discrimination? What can we do in terms of social justice to make sure things don't happen that way and we don't continue those trends? We challenge the system again for part 2. Part 1 is awareness. Part 2 is taking down the system and challenging the system. What can we all do then to make sure that this doesn't continue in the music industry? And again, I'm just thinking of something off the top of my head. The other thing you could do is maybe find a video on the topic. So if you discover, like that example with culinary, if you're teaching culinary and you discover a podcast, take this, put it in your Canvas class, and have the students listen to that podcast, say listen to one episode, have the students reconvene. You could either do a Zoom session or you could have a discussion board set up and then say, based on the podcast about racism in the food industry, what is one idea you have either about changing it, or what is one example in which you've witnessed it or experienced it yourself? And by focusing on witnessing and experience, we also come to terms with the fact that not all of us in our classes as teachers, if we, like myself, come from a privileged background in terms of intersectionality, as Kim Crenshaw talks about, or students in our classes, if you're talking in a criminal justice class or a criminology class in sociology about police profiling, and if the white students are responding to your discussion board and saying, well, I've never been police profiled, so it doesn't exist. And if students of color are having a different experience, that's a teachable moment right there to talk about what we call in feminist theory positionality or standpoint. We all come to understand the world because of our different positions or standpoints in the world, the way that we experience the world. And using that as an engagement in a teachable moment like this could be really great. So if you had the food truck example, or the food industry example rather, you could ask students if they've experienced it. And if you discover, who knows what's going to happen in your discussion, that the students of color have experienced it more than the non-students of color, that is a teachable moment to really engage reflexively, is how we call it in the social science classroom, by bringing the students' personal perspectives and your own perspectives to bear on that moment of pedagogy that you're offering to your students. So when you have your list, you do your Google search, choose 2 or 3 of these, and set up an assignment, a video, a reading, an activity, a discussion, a Zoom session, beginning and middle, wherever you want it in your class, and then that might be an opportunity to really engage your students with these topics in a classroom setting. And so here's an example actually from the class I'm teaching this fall. It's Anthropology 106, Visual Anthropology. And this is a class that certainly could engage in the terrain, the arena, if you will, of social justice. It does in some of the readings, but it's not as explicit as, say, the Social 107 class I've taught in the past, Race and Ethnic Relations. So what I did, and I talked to a couple of my social science colleagues, and I said, what I'm really going to do this quarter is bring this in. And I know Dr. Dirk did this in his political science class. We had a conversation about it. So I said, what are some ways I can bring in a conversation about social justice and race in my particular class? So I have an outline. In this particular outline I use to frame discussions, and it follows 4 topics of vision, media, method, and text. And I said, I want to add something about politics and social justice to this class, and I want it to be really its own topic. I want it to be among these topics. So instead of 4 possible topics that students respond on, they have 5. And I wanted politics then very generally to kind of be that category holder for the topic. So let me show you how you did that. I took my old outlines, and these are just omnigraphal documents, which is a charting program. And again, this wasn't there before. So I took the old ones and I said, how can I bring in some concepts, some themes that will focus on social justice, race, diversity in this class, and it can be a meaningful conversation. So for all 11 weeks of the quarter, I added this bullet, this topical area, and I tried to find articles that would somehow go along with the current topics. It wasn't that easy. If you're talking about Kurosawa's Seven Samurai or the Magnificent Seven, a spaghetti western, actually there'd be a great one there. Too late. I already created this, but actually I'm thinking of the racism in westerns. Specifically, there's a great film called Real Injun, and it's about how Native Americans have been portrayed in westerns and other popular media. So that one would fit in actually really great. I may not have time to do that this quarter, but I could then take something I'm already focused on and try to connect that to social justice, diversity, Black Lives Matter, whatever. So in this case, I have them reading an article about mass incarceration, very key topic for all of this teaching in ISP and others as well. And so I said, okay, what about this article that talks about how mass incarceration is a visual phenomenon? That ties in with visual anthropology and visual culture. What about how teens and the Make America Great movement are using memes or certain often racist, not all of them, but many of them can be very racist in how they target particular groups. The kind of xenophobia that you often hear coming from Washington, D.C., where people are saying we should close our borders, and white supremacists carrying tiki torches, killing people in peaceful demonstrations are good people, and that white supremacists and Nazis are just as good as the people on the other side, the protesters. Those kind of memes then have perpetuated through the internet. A meme is just a very visible and highlighted form of culture that can be like a little image, a symbol that someone has, and it perpetuates itself across the internet. So the students will then have the choice of reading an article about memes and racism. And then they're specifically searching for Pepe the Frog, which if you look that up, it's a frog that's been appropriated by the far right, the neo-Nazis, the alt-right, the white supremacists for perpetuating their vitriolic, hateful, and racist discourses across the internet and on social media. So that's how I'm doing it. I decided I could take each of my weeks, and I've done this for all 11 weeks. And I've added that as a key component. In some cases, it may relate to what we're talking about. In this particular case, we're talking about the visual spectacle of Confederate monuments, to debate that, and then also talk about witnessing and how cell phones have impacted the racism we see in policing, and then the racism we note that's being brought to the forefront with Black Lives Matter and protests happening across the nation. So the cell phone itself is a visual form, and thus I'm connecting issues of racism and police brutality and police murders that have been committed against persons of color, and then I'm connecting that to the actual topic, which is visual culture. So it's kind of a natural tie-in there that wasn't super hard, but it took me a little bit of time to think about that. So the opportunity then you could think about going back to this part of the conversation is, if you want, another opportunity is it could be an activity that connects to something you're already teaching. So what you could do is go through your syllabus and find a section where maybe you talk about a particular topic and you say, I think that would actually connect to something related to social justice, diversity, learning about racism, learning about teaching tolerance, and so forth. So there are opportunities to kind of go through all our syllabi and find those moments where we might make a change. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't require a lot of work. You simply go in, change the outline for that week, add that as a special component. If you want, you could do it through the entirety of a class like I'm doing it from weeks 1 to 11, or you can maybe hit it in week 1 as an icebreaker, do it in week 5, and then also towards the end, just to continue that conversation we've been having on campus about social justice, tolerance, Black Lives Matter, diversity, and so forth. So if you have any other questions, or you want to have conversations about how to take your syllabus or take your class, create an icebreaker about diversity or anti-racism efforts, connect with me. We can have a conversation. I know the college is doing a lot this year. I'm particularly excited about all the initiatives coming out of the President's Office and the Curriculum Committee, Academic Senate, Classified Senate, Student Senate, a lot of efforts happening. The Board of Trustees, of course, also making a number of important statements. So we're going to continue the dialogue, I know, this next year, but given my role working with teaching and pedagogy and approaching online teaching and EVE, I thought I would just throw this video out there. If you want to have a teaching talk just on this topic, we can easily do that. I will resume the teaching talks starting in week 1 of the quarter. They'll always be on Tuesdays from 12 to 1. I'll send the Zoom link out to you shortly. So let's have a conversation. Let's keep up the initiatives and efforts as we collectively focus on race and social justice here at Lake Tahoe Community College. So thanks for listening, and I'll be back with more videos in the future.